It's great to have everyone on board. My name is Ed Marquez. This is Wayland. We're from the Hedera Hashgraph team. We work on DevRel. And I know you've seen quite a bit of QR codes throughout this conference. You're about to see a few more. But these are the slides. So if you want to get those, watch the slides at a later time, or maybe follow along as we talk, feel free to get those.
We'll have some code examples, so that's another thing. So we're sponsoring some bounties. We're going to have some code examples in the slides. So that's, if you want to take a look at those and kind of see some demos, that's a good place to do.
That's right. And to give you a second as well, I also want to get a sense for the room. How many of you haven't heard about Hedera before this? Show of hands. Dano. All right, very cool. This is the session, and in the next 20 minutes, you're going to learn how the Hedera network functions, how you can start development. You're going to see how to deploy a very simple smart contract. It's not just going to be death by PowerPoint. There's going to be code. And you're going to see where to learn more. So let's start by understanding the Hedera network. So Hedera is a third-generation public distributed ledger. And it's built from the ground up to run applications at the scale that the web needs. And so you're familiar with Bitcoin. It introduced decentralized trust and programmable money back in 2009. The second generation was Ethereum, and that introduced programmable smart contracts and also digital assets. And Hedera, being third generation, provides some of these benefits, right? The space and the technology has evolved to the point where a layer 1 can provide 10,000 real user transactions per second at a fraction of a cent per transaction. And also finality or consensus finality from 3 to 5 seconds. And so if we keep looking under the hood, what has made these improvements possible is the algorithm powering the Hedera network, which is the Hashgraph consensus algorithm. So traditional blockchains, like Ethereum, Bitcoin, they're proof of work. They typically require heavy electrical and computational requirements. The consensus is probabilistic, right? So it's just a good enough probability that your transaction is not going to be rolled back. And it's somewhat inefficient because you're constantly pruning the branches, right? You only want a single chain of blocks. And so for those reasons, it can be somewhat difficult to scale these traditional blockchains. Hedera, on the other hand, uses a Hashgraph, right? That's an open source consensus algorithm and data structure. It's a DAG, a directed acyclic graph, and it basically uses two inventions that are novel, which are gossip about gossip and also virtual voting. And right now, Hedera supports the 10,000 transactions per second, and also finality between 3 to 5 seconds. If you did not understand anything I said, or maybe you just spaced out, this is another way to think about it, right? Two different ways to solve a similar problem. Blockchains are usually chopping branches. With the Hashgraph, there's no chopping. Everything is just weaved into the growth of the ledger. And if you're trying to understand how the Hedera network functions, this is the engine, right? The Hashgraph consensus algorithm. And then on top of that, there are network services for different use cases, like the consensus service, if you need a decentralized messaging bus to log transactions immutably, cheaply, and at a very high throughput. There's also the token service for tokenizing everything from shoes to software licenses, vaccines, art, you name it. So you can create fungible and non-fungible tokens at the native layer. And also EVM-compatible smart contracts for those use cases that need more flexibility and programmability. The Hedera Governing Council is what governs the operations of the network, and I'm going to talk more about that in the next slide. And on top of that foundation is where the use cases for data integrity, tokenization, decentralized identity, supply chain, payments, and more, that's where those use cases are built. And so that's where the individuals, the small teams, the startups, the enterprises, governments, even IoT devices can build and add value. And so this is the Hedera Governing Council. It's formed by up to 39 leading global organizations, diversified through different geographies, continents, markets, even cloud infrastructure, and also diversified through time, because they can only serve for 2 3-year terms. Each member has equal influence in the network, so it's a 139th vote. And there are different committees that provide transparency and document all the meeting minutes so that these discussions are made public. And these are the companies and universities running the network nodes as well. So and they're also building use cases. They're not just governing the direction, they're also building use cases. So it's companies like Google, IBM, FPOS, the London School of Economics, Ubisoft, and many more. So if we look at the Hedera network today in terms of adoption and network activity, it's not just for the big players, right? We also have a huge ecosystem of smaller players, individuals, small teams, startups, building very interesting applications. And we're happy to talk more about these if you stop by at our booth. And so these are some of the metrics also of the adoption of the Hedera network. So as of yesterday, we have processed more than 2.1 billion real user submitted transactions, over 500,000 user accounts, and there are more than 8,000 active developers with over 4 million transactions being processed each day. And then in terms of network growth, if we look at our path to decentralization, this is something that is going to happen in phases, right? We want the stake of the network and the nodes to be distributed throughout the world so that no one party controls too much. And this is going to happen in phases. So in the first phase, the nodes are run by the 39 governing council members. In phase 2, we open the network, and this is bound to happen this year. We open the network to KYC'd community nodes. And then the next step, or phase 3, is opening the network to permissionless and anonymous nodes. So that is the path to decentralization. We want to build a network and a company that is around for 100 years plus, and so we want to make sure we get this right. So now that you know a little bit more about Hedera and what it does, I want to introduce Wayland to show us how to start developing on the network and maybe how to start deploying a simple smart contract.
Awesome, thanks Ed. Hey everybody, my name is Wayland. I'm happy to be here. I've been doing some DevRel work for Hedera, and I do a lot of research on mathematics and consensus stability because I'm still a grad student. So some of the research problems relevant to our greater industry. So I'm going to walk through some examples of how we can use maybe the JavaScript SDK to deploy some smart contracts on the Hedera network. We do have $10,000 worth of bounties here at Hedera, so happy to talk more. If you guys have questions, just feel free to reach out to me or Ed, and we're happy to help show you guys how to use some of these development tools. So to deploy a smart contract on Hedera, there's 4 steps we got to go through. First of which, we are going to need to compile the smart contract into bytecode. This can be done with any Solidity compiler. I definitely recommend the Sol-C compiler because it's integrated into a lot of different tools, and there's a Sol-C JS version as well. There's a lot of good tools. We know Solidity development community is rich and thriving, and there's a lot of amazing ecosystem tools there. The next thing we need to do is store the bytecode of this smart contract in the Hedera file service, and this kind of is like the initiation code. So files on Hedera network actually aren't entirely immutable, but once you deploy a contract from the file service, your contract of course is immutable. So the Hedera file service has a variety of different use cases, one of which is being leveraged to deploy your contracts to the network. So after we have our smart contracts bytecode stored in the Hedera file service, we make an API call and create our smart contract. Once our smart contract is deployed, we can interact with it using different API calls, accessing maybe some getter, setter methods, and playing with all sorts of different programmability that's fun and available from using smart contracts. So let's take a look at an example of what some of these look like. So this is just an example contract. It kind of resembles a phone book. It just has some getter and setter of some information, something super simple. We just wanted to provide some elementary examples before we get too technical. And how we would compile this with the Sol-C compiler and then read the bytecode into a variable here in the JavaScript SDK, and this is step 1. After this, you're done. The next thing you're going to need to do is you're going to use the Hashgraph SDK to store the bytecode in the Hedera file service. This is an example of how that looks. It's fairly simple. You, of course, sign your transactions with your keys. If you have any questions about this, again, feel free to reach out afterwards. I'm happy to talk more about the different parameters in the SDK and some of the tools that we make available. So after we upload our contract to the Hedera file service, we can use the contract create API call. And here is where we actually deploy the contract to the network from the file service. And if we have constructor parameters in our contract, this is also where we would need to pass the constructor parameters as well. After we have a contract deployed, we can use the contract ID to call the contract and interact with the contract's public viewable functions. And that's about it. Here's some examples of calling our setter and getter with our mobile phone book example contract. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. And with that, I'll give it back to Ed here.
And then the output of this example is, what those pieces of code would log to the console, right? So for step 2, you show the bytecode file ID, so the file that you created on the network containing that bytecode. Then step 3, you basically show the smart contract ID now on the Hedera network, and that also has an equivalent as a Solidity address format. And then the last step is basically getting the results of the functions of the smart contract that you're executing. So for example, with the constructor function, you passed Alice's phone number, which was the 1111, right? And then you queried that information. So that's the first line that you see there in the step 4. The second step is making sure that that call was successful, and then also outputting Bob's number, which is the 222 there that you see. So that is a simple getter-setter smart contract. If you want to deploy smart contracts that interact with Hedera tokens, we also have examples and tutorials to do that. And with that, I want to go into the last section for today, which is getting resources to learn more about the Hedera network and also Web3. So you're going to get these slides, and you'll have access to these links. But I certainly recommend going to the Hedera Get Started. It's for developers and non-technical folks to learn more. Also, the Hedera Learning Center has great information about Web3 and also Hedera-related concepts. I encourage you to join the developer Discord. There's a ton of great technical discussions happening there. And then great information on our documentation and also the Hedera YouTube channel in terms of tutorials and conceptual overviews, even of our co-founder, Dr. Lehman Baird, explaining many of these concepts. But before you start, building, make sure you get a free Testnet account. You can scan this QR code now or once you get the slides. But obviously, that's a free account that gets recharged with 10,000 fake HBARs for you to play and try and test out your applications as you develop them. All right, so hopefully in these last 20 minutes, you learn about the Hedera network, how it works, how you can start developing a simple smart contract or applications, and also where to learn more about Web3 and the Hedera network. With that, I think we have a few more minutes for questions, but we want to thank you for your attention.